Hello, welcome back to Jen's Books. How are you doing? I hope you're having a great week and reading something really fantastic at the moment. I have just started the Bandit Queen, so I will be telling you all about that in my next May roundup. But this is my first roundup of the month, where I'm going to talk about the first 8 books that I've read so far this May. So the challenge I set myself was to read 100 books, or at least 100 books in 2023. So far, I think I've worked out that I've read about 74. So I'm doing really, really well. I'm hoping by the end of this month I'll have reached 80, and then once I reach 100, I might think about increasing it slightly, but we'll see how we're feeling when we get to that point. But this is the first roundup for May, and I've read such a weird mix of things this month. I actually wrote this down. There's 2 classics I've read, 1 book that's been recently shortlisted for the Women's Prize, 1 horror, 1 thriller, and 1 memoir, along with 2 books that have been recommended by Jen Campbell on her channel. So a real mix of different books, and hopefully something for everybody in this first roundup. So the first book I read was Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris, and I was very excited to get a signed copy of this. Even though it's a paperback, it's a signed copy, and it's one that, when I first heard about the long list of the Women's Prize, it was the one that I wanted to read right from the beginning, but I hadn't been able to get hold of it straight away. So I did manage to get hold of it when I was down in London, and I gobbled it up. This book that I read in a day, which I think already sort of says quite a lot for it. But the premise is, it's Sarajevo 1992. Our main character, Zora, is an artist. She's working in the centre of Sarajevo in the town hall. She has her own gallery there. Her mother isn't well, and her husband, Frago, takes her mother to go and visit their daughter, Dubrovka, who's living in the UK. And it's just at the beginning of the troubles, before the siege really takes hold, and they try to encourage Zora to come over with them to the UK, but she's no, she wants to paint, she wants to have this time. It's only going to be a couple of weeks. She wants to focus on her paintings of bridges. She's painting the Goat Bridge, and bridges is kind of what she's known for in terms of being an artist. But not long after they leave, things start to deteriorate really rapidly, and she finds that she's stuck in Sarajevo. She can no longer leave. They're a city under siege. They're being bombed, and things just get worse and worse. It feels really authentic, and it feels that it's not right that this is a debut novel. It's just fantastic. The way it's written is beautiful. It feels really authentic. You can tell that Priscilla Morris had based her story on family and friends' accounts of that time in Sarajevo and what they were facing. And poor Zora, she becomes trapped in her building, but it kind of explores what happens when everything you think you care about is taken away, and when you find joy in new things and in small things, and the relationships that she builds with the people around her. So for example, there are families that live in the house, in the building with her, in the flat. There's a Muslim neighbour called Mirasad, who she becomes very close to, and it feels very contemporary, also feels really classic. It has that feel of some of the World War II books that I've read, but with everything that's going on in the world at the moment, it feels all too prescient. And I really, really recommend this. I think it's a fantastic read. I just, as I say, inhaled it in just a couple of sittings. It's a really interesting exploration of relationships under pressure, but also an insight into what a city under siege, what effect that has on people. And we know that this is just the beginning of what happened to Sarajevo. But yeah, I definitely recommend it. One to pick up if you've not read it. It's in the shortlist for the Women's Prize, so hopefully it will do well for that one. The second book I read was a classic. I promised a couple of classics, and I read Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. It's a play that I'd seen, but I'd never read the actual novella, and it's one that I felt like I should probably read. And so we're going from 90s Sarajevo to 1930s California, Depression era. This novella was written in 1937, and it's an exploration of two itinerant workers who are travelling across California looking for work, working on farms. There's George Milton and Lenny Smalls. The irony being that Lenny isn't small at all. He's a really big guy, and they've known each other from childhood, so they've fallen in together, travelling from place to place, getting work, and they have this dream of saving money and buying their own farm where they can live together in peace and, grow their own food and have their own lives instead of working on other people's farms. And Lenny has learning difficulties, and George kind of looks out for him, but Lenny doesn't know his own strength, so there's sort of results that they get into trouble. There are sort of trigger warnings about this novella. There are some pretty unpleasant racial slurs used in the book, but in terms of the sort of the pitch and the structure, it's just beautifully written, and it's this really insightful exploration into their unlikely friendship. There always, when I was sort of thinking about the play when I'd seen it, I always assumed they were brothers. So reading back through the novella, it was interesting to sort of, they don't really go into a huge amount of detail about how these two guys ended up travelling together, but there's sort of a hint of it through their childhood. And I would say, yeah, definitely worth reading. Only about 100 pages, beautifully paced. There are some trigger warnings to say, it's worth looking that up if there are things that do, upset you in writing. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. It's sort of a exploration of loneliness and isolation. It's an exploration of the risk of the great American dream and believing in that great American dream in a time of depression. So definitely recommend that. I read that one on the Kindle, so for 99p as well, you can't really go wrong. The second classic I read is one that's been on my TBR for a really long time, which is Toni Morrison, Beloved. I only ever hear fabulous things about this. It was published in 1987. I believe it won the Pulitzer Prize in 1988 as well for a novel. And it's heartbreaking. It's my first Toni Morrison, and it definitely has given me an appetite to read more of her work. She has a very unique voice, and I know that Sula's also supposed to be fantastic, and the Pale Blue Eyes or something like that. I've got a couple of them lined up to read. But this story is about Sefe and how she escapes slavery with her 4 children to go and live with her mother-in-law. And it sort of flashes forwards and backwards in time quite a lot. It can be a little bit disorientating at times, and a little bit disorientating as to who is actually telling the story at any time. But it's one of those books where if you've been reading thrillers and things like that, which I have been reading this month, it's a change in pace. You have to kind of change the pace and take your time with this one. But the story is all about how Sefe's trying to move forward from her past, but she's also really, really haunted by it, in particular the death of her oldest daughter. And, it's a kind of a Southern Gothic haunting, in that she believes that her daughter has come back to her in the form of a stranger that they find living in the area, or sort of collapsed outside their house. So it's ambiguous as to whether this stranger is her daughter come back to haunt her, or whether she's sort of a random woman who's sort of escaped other trials. But it's difficult to read at times. It's harrowing. It's harrowing, but it's beautifully written as well. And there's hope. There's hope in there as well. But just a really interesting exploration of slavery, and that time after the Civil War, when the laws were beginning to change, but not really having a massive effect on making people feel safe in their own skins. And so, yeah, definitely recommend it. I've heard loads of wonderful things about it, but it's very unique, as I say, in terms of the voice, and it's made me want to read more Toni Morrison. I can certainly understand why this was a big prize winner. The next book that I read was something completely different, which was Horrorstor by Grady Hendrix. And the reason I picked this up is I'd read How to Sell a Haunted House, which I'd enjoyed. It's a comedy horror, and I think this was the first one that he published. But what I really loved about it is the premise is that it's about haunted, not an IKEA, but like a knockoff IKEA. But what's wonderful about this book is it's actually designed like a catalogue. So there's sort of images of different things that you can buy in this store, and even at the back where the author's picture is, it says any questions, just ask. Ask is the name of the shop they live in. So the premise is our central character Amy, she works in this branch of Orsk, and she doesn't want to continue working there. She wants to go back to the branch that she used to work in, but she needs the money. She's behind in payments on her rent. She's living a sort of hand-to-mouth existence, on minimum wage, working for this location, and she doesn't like the manager. She feels that Basil is out to get her and is about to sort of sack her at any time, so she's trying to avoid him. But then they discovered that there's some vandalism happening overnight in the store, so Basil asks Amy and one of their other employees, Ruth, who is just sort of the sweet as pies, worked for the place for ages, but turns out she's a spine of steel, and they go over to stay overnight to look into what's happening, to try and solve the mystery of what this vandalism is being caused by. And initially there seems to be quite a simple answer to this, but then we discover that Orsk, this branch of Orsk, was actually built on an old penitentiary, from the previous century, where the warden used a sort of horrific and experimental means to treat his wards in this prison. And the past is sort of bleeding into the present. I don't want to give any more away than that, really, but it's silly and fun and stupid and scary and made me turn the pages. It's kind of gross as well, but I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to reading more of his work. Actually, I have I can't remember the actual name of the title. There's something like The Last Woman Standing Club or something, which I've just started as well. But I just love the style of this as well, and just so original. I've never seen anything like it. The style of the book as a catalogue and the way it's laid out inside. But yeah, big fan of Grady Hendrix so far, and if you like silly horror, definitely recommend him to you if you've not read his work before. After that, I read a thriller. I promised some thrillers as well. I love a good thriller. I love a good page turner. And I came across The Resort, which was published in 2023 by Sarah Goodwin on my Kindle. I will put an image up for you to see. And the premise is that Mila and her husband Ethan are travelling to Germany for her sister's wedding, Jess. Jess and Mila have had a bit of a difficult relationship growing up. Mila was always the family favourite, and their parents couldn't do enough for her, whereas Jess, although she's stunning and has this amazing job and is incredibly intelligent and is the one that had all the sort of gifts in many ways, is treated really badly by the parents. And because of this, Mila feels like she really owes her, and she wants nothing more to ensure that Jess's wedding is just a fabulous affair, and it is everything that she dreams of. So they're travelling over to this Bavarian ski resort for the wedding, and the car breaks down in the middle of nowhere on like a dirt track. She wakes up and her husband's like, uh-oh, the car's broken down, there's snow falling, and the only thing they've seen is the sign to a village. So they decide to try and walk to the village to try and get help and to try and get them out of the situation. But when they get there, it's like an abandoned hamlet with just huts that are all in different stages of dilapidation. So they bed down there for the night, and when they wake up, Mila finds she's on her own. So they advertise this book as this giant twist, and I guess the twist pretty early doors, but not how the twist was going to happen. And one of the things I would say is, I definitely enjoyed reading this book. I definitely kept turning the pages all the way through. It's probably not the most sophisticatedly not the most sophisticated plot of a thriller that I've read, but there was something about this character being alone in this dilapidated village, having to try and feed herself and keep herself warm against the elements, and when there's these sort of supernatural elements taking place as well, that I really enjoyed. There were elements of plausibility that I, even at the time, I thought, why haven't you done this? Why haven't you questioned this? But I suppose that's part of the thriller as well. But I definitely kept turning the pages, and the ending wasn't what I expected. It went in a different direction than I thought it was going to. So if you like a sort of fast-paced thriller that's going to take you somewhere really cold and creepy, then yeah, definitely recommend it. It was a quick read, it was an enjoyable read, and it definitely kept me turning the pages throughout. I would probably say a 3.5 out of 5. If I'm comparing it to Black Butterflies, which was my first book of the reads, that's definitely a 5 out of 5 for me. And Beloved, 5 out of 5. But as a thriller, I thought it worked well, and then it was an enjoyable read. The next couple of books I read were recommendations from Jen Campbell's YouTube channel, which I do recommend. She's introduced me to a lot of really interesting works, and one of them is Indelicacy by Amina Cain, and this was published in 2020. And something I love is coming across of odd little books, and this definitely counts in the odd little books categories. It's not a big read. Very unique. I've never read anything quite like it, and it's one of those books that feels effortless. The prose is really spare, and but actually it sort of engages with a lot of different topics. The character is a cleaner called Victoria, who works in a art gallery, and she's really interested in the art. I love books about artists. I love books about art. And she describes some of the paintings in the art gallery. But what's really interesting is it's difficult to gauge what time period this is actually based in, and that would usually annoy me. I like to know where I am and who I'm with. But actually it is quite interesting. It didn't bother me as much as I thought it was going to. She meets her husband. Her husband has plenty of money, and she's in a position of privilege. No longer has to work in the gallery. She makes new friends and goes to the ballet and has beautiful things and spends lots of money. But what she really craves is space to write. She's a frustrated writer. That's all she wants to do. And there's bits in here where she writes about paintings and things. I'm never entirely clear what sort of writer she really wants to be, but she wants space to write. And she finds, even though she has that now, she's still unable to do so. But it's an interesting book. It's about being a writer. It's about craving space for creativity, but also it's about gender and class. So there's a lot about it that I really enjoyed. It was a quick read. It was an odd little book, and I like an odd little book. Did I enjoy it as much as the next on my list? No. But I think it was definitely interesting, and I enjoyed the sort of unusual voice of the writers. I say, that kind of sparse prose that she uses. So yeah, interesting. It's been compared to A Room of One's Own, which I've not actually read. But yeah, so if you like that, maybe this will be one that you enjoy. Next was another book that was recommended by Jen Campbell, and it's by a writer that I'd read before, Alice Thompson. I read Burnt Island, which is one of her novels. I read it probably about 10 years ago whenever it came out. This is The Book Collector, which came out in 2015. And I really, really enjoyed this. I was writing some notes as I was reading it. It reminded me of the yellow wallpaper. It reminds me of Bluebeard. There's definitely elements of, very clear elements of Bluebeard here. If you're a fan of Angela Carter, you're probably going to enjoy this book. It's again about a wife that comes from not a huge amount of money. She meets her husband in a cafe. He slips her his card. He's quite a bit older than her, and she goes and finds him in a second-hand bookstore which he owns, and they meet and they marry, and it feels like she has everything. She has a beautiful house, she has a beautiful son called Felix, and you know, generally a wonderful life. But after she has her son, she starts suffering with sort of psychosis. She's seeing things, she's hallucinating, and her husband sends her to the local asylum where she's treated. And it's a really interesting insight. As I say, there's this sense that her husband is trying to, well, there's an ambiguity of how much of it is that she really is suffering with psychosis, and how much of it is he's trying to make her believe that she is. And the crux of it all is this forbidden book, which is where the Bluebeard sort of thing comes in. You know, they have a library full of books. She can look at any book she wants, but she goes into the safe to find this book of fairy tales, and that seems to be what kicks everything off. And when she comes out of the asylum, her husband has hired a nurse to help bring up the child, so she has more time to herself, but something doesn't feel right about the whole setup. So it's sort of deeply gothic, very fairy tale, but also really interesting exploration into mental health, into motherhood, into what we do for our children, you know, when push comes to shove. And I really, really enjoyed it. And as I say, for fans of, you know, Angela Carter and that sort of feminist rewriting, I would definitely recommend this. I enjoyed this. I would say 4.5 if I enjoyed this, a 3.5 if that makes sense, out of 5. But yeah, really, really enjoyed that, and I wasn't disappointed. I love Burnt Island as well, but I think I like this one even more. So thank you, Jen, for the recommendation. Loved it. The last book I read was a autobiography, and it's one that's been doing the rounds for a while. It was published in 2016, and it was written by Paul Kalanithi. It's called When Breath Becomes Air. And the book's actually completed by Paul's wife. He was basically an American neuroscientist, and the book's kind of in two parts really, before and after. The before is when he talks about his journey through medical school, his obsession with understanding the nature of death and the spirituality of death, and what happens when somebody actually dies. And at one point it looks like he might become a literature professor, but he decides instead to you know, throw his all into neuroscience and becomes a surgeon. And you can tell by the writing that he's incredibly intelligent, you know, that incredibly intelligent, and he talks a lot about that fascination with the mind and where the mind and spirit meet. But unfortunately he is then diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, and we then are sort of thrown into you know, how that affects him and his life, and the sort of roller coaster as the different treatments start to fail him. The ending is really, really sad. You know, I don't think I'm giving away any spoilers there for anybody who's heard about the book. But yeah, it was an interesting insight into sort of the philosophical, but also his own personal journey as his body sort of begins to let him down, and he's a new father as well. But yeah, it shook me a bit actually when I was reading a bit more about the book, because I read it on Kindle, but he's almost exactly the same age as me, and the fact that he achieved so much in his life, but also that the sadness and the tragedy of losing a partner so young, you know, and having their child and things. It just, I found it, you know, it's an emotional investment if you're wanting to read it, but one that's worth taking. So as promised, a real mix of different books, and hopefully there's something there that will interest you. And if it's something you've already read, I'd love to know what your thoughts are on those. If you have any recommendations based on the books that I've read so far this month. As I say, I'm currently reading another Grady Hendrix silly horror, and I'm also reading The Bandit Queens. So hopefully those will be two that I will talk about in my next video. or my next May roundup. But let me know what you think. Like, subscribe, come along for the ride, and I'll see you again later in the week. Thanks. Bye.